Good afternoon to all of those that have joined us or watching after the event through the social channels where we've shared the presentation and the webinar with you today. For those who don't know, my name is Stephen Kelly. I'm Chief Executive of Manufacturing Northern Ireland. Today's session is on cyber risk, contracts and compliance, strengthening your defences in 2026. Good afternoon, and you're all very welcome. For manufacturers and businesses across the wider economy, cyber risk is no longer just a technical issue sitting with your IT team. As organizations become more connected through digital systems, supply chains, and data, the potential impact of an incident is much broader. It can affect your operations, customer relationships, contracts, compliance, and wider business continuity. At the same time, expectations around resilience, reporting, and accountability are increasing. That means businesses need to be thinking not only about how to prevent incidents, but also how they respond, how they manage risk and protect themselves contractually and legally when issues do arise. Today's session is intended to give businesses a clear understanding of the legal and practical issues around cyber resilience and what they should be thinking about now and taking action on now. Very pleased and delighted to be joined by Aisling O'Hare, who's a partner in commercial law at our legal partner, Mills Selig. Aisling is a commercial lawyer with more than 10 years experience advising businesses across Northern Ireland on corporate and commercial matters. She has expertise in commercial contracts, cybersecurity, regulatory compliance, and dispute resolution, and works with clients across Northern Ireland, ranging from SMEs to our larger enterprises. Today, Aisling will talk through some of the key issues businesses should be aware of, including contractual and supply chain liabilities, breach notification obligations, and what regulatory duties look like in practice. Before I hand over to Aisling, just a couple of quick housekeeping points. Today's session is being recorded, and we will share both the slides and the recording after the event for those that have registered and others. We do have time for questions at the end, so please do send those through either using the Q&A function or the chat function. But do bear in mind, this isn't about giving free legal advice. If there are very specific legal questions that you have, I'm sure that Aisling and our colleagues would be very much delighted to respond to those and pick up with those. So if you want, contact details are available at the end, or you can contact myself or colleagues in Manufacturing NI, and we'll make sure that there's a connection made with Aisling and our colleagues. So thanks for joining us, Aisling. I'll hand over to yourself. We'll come back to you at the end of your presentation with some questions that we have and some questions that others may have. Thanks very much for joining us, and we'll hand over to yourself to run through your presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks, Stephen, for the introduction and the opportunity to speak with you all today. So just by way of brief introduction again, I'm a partner in Mills Selig, and we are a commercial firm based in Belfast. So I advise on commercial contracts, intellectual property, cyber and data protection, and increasingly on helping organisations manage their cyber risk in a way that is legally defensible and aligned with how organisations actually work on a day-to-day basis. So I'm here to talk about cyber risk, which has become one of the most significant and persistent risk areas facing organisations across all sectors, but particularly in manufacturing. So as you'll all no doubt be aware, cyber threats are continuing to evolve, and the legal framework is shifting quickly to try to keep pace. So as Stephen said, cyber risk, it's no longer something that sits neatly within your IT teams. Today, it's very clearly a board level issue. It cuts across your contracts, your operational resilience and business continuity, your regulatory exposure, and ultimately your reputation. So what I want to do today is to cut through some of that noise. So this will not be a technical deep dive into the cyber measures that you should have in place. And I'll also try not to make it a fear-driven law lecture. But instead, I want to provide you with some practical steps that you can take away to help address and assess your own cyber risk. So today, what we will cover is the evolving threat landscape with a focus on manufacturing. We'll look at the legal and regulatory environment and what regulators are actually focusing on. We look at managing contractual and supply chain liability. We'll look at breach notifications and your obligations in practice. And then finally, some practical steps that you can take to avoid regulatory action. And then hopefully at the end, we'll have some time for questions. So to begin, it's important to set the scene by looking briefly at how the cyber threat landscape continues to evolve, and particularly why manufacturing has become such a prominent target. Cyber incidents, they're not new, but the scale, frequency, and impact of the attacks has changed dramatically over the last decade. So manufacturing has become one of the most heavily targeted sectors globally, and there are several reasons why that is. Manufacturers rely on a wide network of suppliers, subcontractors, and software vendors. So each one of those creates another potential point of vulnerability, and attackers are very good at finding the weakest link. So critically for manufacturers, an attack can cause downtime, which costs real money, not just in lost data, but also in lost output, missed deliveries, contractual penalties, and regulatory scrutiny. And attackers understand this. They understand that there's going to be intense pressure to restore operations quickly, which can be exploited during an incident. So when we look at the types of attacks that matter most today, four broad categories dominate. So firstly, ransomware. So this remains the headline act, and that's because it hits everything at once. So your data, your operations, your customer commitments, and your reputation. And today's variants are designed to steal your sensitive data, encrypt your systems, and pressure you via your customers and suppliers whose data is affected. So the impact of ransomware attacks can be immediate and severe. So your production lines can be shut down, distribution can grind to a halt, and systems can be compromised or taken offline, and the financial impact can escalate very quickly. And then also from a legal perspective, ransomware incidents, they raise other issues. So there could be personal data exposed, which then triggers your data protection obligations. There could be regulatory reporting obligations, and there might be operational disruption that triggers contractual liability. Next, then we have supply chain attacks, which is something I will talk about throughout this webinar today. Increasingly, organizations are breached, not just because of their own failures, but because attackers target their suppliers with weaker security controls. So as a result, regulators expect organizations to know who their critical suppliers are, to assess their security posture, and be able to demonstrate that those assessments are meaningful, proportionate, and ongoing. So the third persistent risk is insider activity and human error. So in most cases, this is not malicious. It's usually accidental. So it could be someone clicking on a phishing link, someone misconfiguring a system, or you send information to the wrong recipient. So these types of incidents rarely make the headlines, but they account for a very substantial proportion of reportable breaches. From a regulatory perspective, these types of incidents are often treated as preventable. So regulators will ask, were staff appropriately trained? Was access limited to what was necessary? Was suspicious activity detected promptly? And whether policies were actually implemented in practice and not just written down. And then finally, another attack that's accelerating rapidly is the use of AI by attackers. So AI is now used to generate highly convincing phishing emails, create deepfake audio and video, impersonate suppliers, clone voices for authorization calls, generate fake invoices. The list can go on. And the result is that attacks are now more targeted, more believable, and harder to detect than before. This has significant implications for organizations. So processes that rely on voice recognition or informal verification, they are increasingly vulnerable. And the security controls that you have in place need to evolve to reflect that changing threat landscape. Additionally, employee training should be updated to reflect the latest trends. So not to try to scare you, but it's also just worth looking at a few recent cases just to demonstrate the types of cyber attacks that we've seen in recent years. So firstly, in March 2024, Nexperia, who are a global semiconductor firm, they suffered a data breach where an unauthorized third party accessed their IT servers. The attackers stole hundreds of gigabytes of confidential intellectual property, including information on chip designs and trade secrets. They also stole employee personal data, which potentially triggered GDPR investigations. And finally, the breach reportedly exposed sensitive data from major customers like SpaceX, Apple, and Huawei, which had the potential to strain those relationships and cause reputational damage. So that breach demonstrates the significant and wide-ranging impacts of a breach. Then we have Clorox. So in August 2023, Clorox, who are a US manufacturer, suffered a ransomware attack. Following the attack, Clorox was forced to go back to their manual processes because their automation systems took nearly 6 weeks to normalize. That left retailers and consumers scrambling for merchandise, and as a result, their sales were impacted, and it was estimated that they lost over 500 million in revenue. And then Toyota. So a recent breach involving Toyota highlights just how modern cyber incidents actually happen. So the breach wasn't a direct compromise of Toyota's core systems. Instead, a third-party developer published access keys that gave an attacker access to Toyota's systems. That access led to the exposure of significant amounts of data, including customer and employee information. And that was later published on a hacking forum by a group claiming that they had been inside the network for some time. So what's important here is that the breach originated outside Toyota's primary systems. The attackers didn't need to break through the front door. They exploited on the supply chain. And if that wasn't bad enough, a few years before this, an attack on a major supplier of plastic parts to Toyota forced Toyota to pause production at all of its facilities in Japan, halting the production of approximately 13,000 vehicles, and it incurred an estimated loss of 350 million in a single day. So that's how breaches are happening today. Not always through the organization itself, but through adjacent systems and partners. So the key takeaway is that modern cyber risk isn't confined to one single organization. It extends across every system, every supplier, and connection that an organization relies on. So turning now to the legal landscape on cyber laws, and I'll keep this high level. So in the UK, cyber obligations don't sit neatly within a single cyber act that you can point to and say, that's the rule book. Instead, cyber obligations come from a layered framework of laws, each dealing with a different aspect of risk. And in practice, those layers often overlap. So because of time constraints today, I'm not going to do a walkthrough of the legislation line by line. I'm sure you'll be glad to hear. But what I want to do instead is just set out where the regulatory exposure usually arises after an incident. So for most organisations, the first and most immediate exposure following a cyber incident arises under UK GDPR and the Data Protection Act, but that's only where personal data is involved. So that could include employee personal data and any customer or supplier personal data. Alongside this sits the Privacy and Electronic Communications regulations, which govern electronic communications, marketing practices, and cookies. So these are often less central in a ransomware style incident, but they can still be relevant depending on what systems are affected. And then there are the network and information systems regulations. So these impose cyber resilience and incident reporting obligation on certain operators of essential services and digital services providers. So not every manufacturer will be directly in scope of these regulations, but these regulations are still influential because it affects how regulators think about resilience, governance, and reporting. And then finally, beyond the legislation, there could be sector-specific regulations and contractual obligations. This is particularly important for manufacturing because even where you're not directly regulated by a sector body, your customers may impose standards and contracts that are actually stricter than the law itself. So it's impossible to talk about legislation without mentioning the unique position that Northern Ireland organisations are in, because for many NI organisations, the picture is more complex. Many businesses here operate cross-border, so they could supply into EU or they could be part of EU-linked supply chains. And as a result, cyber legislation cannot be ignored, even when your legal base is in the UK. So at an EU level, the direction of travel is very clear. The EU is moving towards a more prescriptive, harmonised and enforcement-focused cyber resilience framework. And there's a few important developments to be aware of. Firstly, it's the Digital Operation Resilience Act, or DORA, as it's also known. So this applies directly to the financial sector. Most manufacturers won't be directly in scope of this legislation, but DORA is important because it shows just how far regulators are willing to go on governance, testing, and third-party oversight. Next is the Cyber Resilience Act that introduces security obligations for products with digital elements placed on the EU market. And then there's NIS2, which is an update of the original NIS directive, which the UK had implemented prior to Brexit. So we could probably spend the entire session talking about NIS2, but in very high level terms, NIS2 significantly expands the scope of the original NIS directive. It tightens reporting timelines, it places heavy emphasis on supply chain risk, and it introduces much stronger expectations around senior management accountability. So for Northern Ireland organisations, NIS2 matters because many NI businesses will have operations in Ireland or they'll have a supply chain based in the EU, so they could sit across two regulatory frameworks at the same time. So this creates a situation whereby the same group might be subject to UK cyber laws on one side and then NIS2 obligations on the other side. But even where you're not legally caught by NIS2, EU customers are increasingly writing those NIS2 style obligations into their contracts. So things like very short notification windows, cooperation obligations, and specific security controls. So this is something that you should look out for in your contracts. What I would say as well, though, is that even though the UK is no longer bound by EU legislation, the new NIS2 directive is shaping regulatory thinking here. So in response to NIS2, the UK government has introduced the Cybersecurity and Resilience Bill, which is currently making its way through Parliament. So the detail on that bill is still evolving, but the direction of travel will sound very familiar. So expect wider scopes, stronger supply chain obligations, more structured reporting, and enhanced enforcement power. So what's the practical takeaway from all of this? The answer is not to try and predict which regime will dominate in the long term. The far more sensible approach is to build procedures and governance that can support multiple frameworks that have clear escalation paths, disciplined incident response, defensible decision making, and evidence that you can produce quickly. So if you can do that, you reduce your legal risk in the UK, you protect your EU trading relationships, and most importantly, you're in a far stronger position if something were ever to go wrong. So this brings us to contractual and supply chain liability, which is one of the most common sources of legal exposure following a cyber incident. For most organizations today, and particularly manufacturing, cyber risk does not sit neatly within your own four walls. You'll rely heavily on third parties for critical systems and services. And the problem we see time and time again is that these contracts governing those relationships often don't reflect the reality of the cyber risk that they create. So I'll try to bring this to life with a scenario that illustrates just how things can go wrong in practice. So imagine you've a managed service provider that has administrative access across your environment. That provider is attacked, and the attackers get access to your system and push ransomware into your network. And they get access to your operational and employee data, which they then threaten to publish. Following this, production's disrupted, deliveries are missed, customers are asking questions. So then you turn to your contract that you have with your provider and you discover that the security schedule's a single paragraph. There's no requirement on the provider to maintain a backup of the data, and the provider's liability is capped at 3 months service phase. So there are some obvious problems here. Firstly, from a regulatory perspective, the fact that the supplier caused the incident does not remove your accountability. Regulators will still look to you to demonstrate that you've carried out appropriate due diligence, imposed reasonable security obligations, and that you had an effective escalation procedure in place. Second, from an incident response perspective, the contract actively works against you. The reference to notify promptly, that gives you no certainty about when you'll be informed, what information you'll receive, or who the escalation route is to. So in a ransomware scenario, that lack of clarity can cost time. Third, there's a complete mismatch between access and controls. So the supplier has administrative access, but there's no meaningful assurances or details in the contract on the security measures that they have in place to protect your data. Fourthly, the liability position bears no resemblance to reality. So 3 months service fees will not cover your forensic investigations, legal advice, remediation, customer claims, or regulatory exposure. So in practice, the liability cap means that the supplier carries almost none of the risk that they've created. So while the technical incident may have started with, say, a phishing email, the real damage is now being driven by those contractual gaps. And just to say, like, that scenario isn't far-fetched at all. When we review contracts after real incidents, we see the same gaps coming up time and time again. So things like vague security clauses, phrases like best industry practice or appropriate security measures, they sound reassuring, but without proper definition, they're very difficult to enforce. Because in a dispute, that vagueness doesn't really help anybody. Second, you might have audit rights that don't work in practice. Thirdly, there might be incident notification clauses that are unclear. Fourth, there's no requirement on your supplier to flow down the security obligations to its subcontractors. This is a critical weakness because your supplier that you contract with may not be the one that's actually touching your systems. Contracts contain liability caps that bear no relationship to reality. So as I mentioned, the cost of a cyber incident is rarely limited to service fees. So caps that are too low can render the contract meaningless. And finally, liability exclusions that wipe out your recovery entirely. So for example, if you have a supplier that's excluded liability for consequential loss or loss of data, cyber losses very often fall into those categories of loss, and they are exactly the types of losses that you would want to be able to recover for. So the obvious question then is, what do we do about it? The answer, it's not to reinvent every contract from scratch. It's to take a structured, risk-aligned approach. So standardize your cybersecurity clauses and make sure they are aligned to your risk. have a baseline set of security requirements that you apply consistently across your contracts, and then you can scale them up or down depending on the relevant service. Next, you should tighten your notification requirements, set a timeline of when you should be notified, who will be notified, and what information you should be provided. Next, you should ensure that your security obligations flow down to your suppliers and also their subcontractors. You should include audit rights, assurance mechanisms, for example, check if they have independent certifications like ISO certifications, align liability with reality. So look at carve-outs for data protection breaches and include minimum caps for certain types of loss. And then finally, you should align your contracts with your cyber insurance position. Just to flag, cyber insurance is an important part of resilience, but it's not a substitute for robust supplier management, clear contractual risk allocation, or documented governance. Insurers are increasingly expected to see these controls in place before they will engage meaningfully on a claim. And when they're missing, recovery can become slower, more difficult, and it can become more limited. So the key message here is that cyber risk in the supply chain is not just about who caused the breach, but it's about who carries the risk when it happens. And more often than not, that answer is written down in your contracts. So reviewing your contracts is one of the key takeaways that I would urge you all to take from today. So let's turn now to breach notification, because this is one of the areas where organizations most consistently get into difficulty, even where the underlying incident itself might have been manageable. So where the incident involves personal data, UK GDPR will come into play. I'm sure most of you will be familiar with UK GDPR, but just as a reminder, you must report personal data breaches within 72 hours to the ICO, where the breach is likely to result in a risk to the rights and freedoms of individuals. So one of the most common misunderstandings we still see is, when does that clock start? So it's 72 hours from becoming aware of a personal data breach, not 72 hours from completing your investigation or receiving initial forensic reports. Awareness is a really low threshold. Over the past 12 to 18 months, we've seen the ICO take a much more assertive enforcement stance. When we look at enforcement notices, the same core failures appear again and again. So there's delayed action on alerts, insufficient technical and organisational measures, no tested disaster recovery plan, no documented risk assessments, policies that might look great on paper but aren't followed in practice, and confusing or outdated contracts. So if we look at some recent action taken by the ICO, just last year, Capita agreed a £14 million settlement with the ICO following a cyber attack that affected 6.6 million people. What's particularly noteworthy here is what the ICO focused on. So the ICO highlighted a 58-hour delay in isolating a compromised device despite early alerts, alongside poor access controls and inadequate incident response resourcing. The lesson here is that delayed response and weak governance can turn a manageable incident into a major enforcement event. Another case is advanced computer software. So in March 2025, Advanced was fined just over £3 million following a cyber attack that disrupted 82 NHS organisations. This case was significant for two reasons. Firstly, the underlying failures were very familiar. So lack of multi-factor authentication, known vulnerabilities were not patched. These are the types of issues that most organisations would view as baseline controls. And then secondly, and most importantly, this was the first major ICO penalty imposed on a data processor rather than a controller. So the message here is clear that processors are now firmly within enforcement scope. If you're a processor, regulators expect you to meet the same standards of security and governance. And then finally, it's also worth mentioning the Marks and Spencer cyber incident that occurred last year. So this attack resulted from a threat actor using an employee's legitimate access details. The attack resulted in M&S experiencing significant disruption to its services, including the ability to accept contactless payment, suspension of online orders, click and collect service interruptions. It led to empty shelves in some M&S stores. They had to ask around 200 agency staff to stay home, and remote employees were locked out of the IT systems. So while the ICO have not yet issued a fine, the M&S cyber attack is a reminder that cybersecurity is not just an IT issue, but it can have significant legal and business risks. So across all of these cases, the same themes keep reappearing. So it's ransomware, supply chain vulnerabilities, and operational disruption, and the growing importance of governance, not just your technical controls. So if you can show good governance, even when an attacker still got through, you're in a far stronger regulatory position. So to finish off today, what can you actually do and how do you avoid regulatory action? The first practical step I would recommend is to carry out a joint legal and technical gap analysis against the relevant frameworks that apply to you, whether that's UK GDPR, NIS directives, or any of the EU regulations. Bringing your legal and technical teams together in that process is essential. From a technical standpoint, you might need to obtain specialist information security advice about the measures that are appropriate for your business. Appropriate technical and organizational measures now routinely include things like multi-factor authentication, encryption, and a tested incident response process. But technical controls, they're only one half of the picture. Governance is equally as important, and in many cases, it's where organizations struggle. So regulators now expect to see routine board level reporting on cyber risk, demonstrating that senior leadership has visibility of the risk and is actively engaged in decision making. This doesn't mean turning board meetings into technical briefings, but what it does mean is that there's clear ownership of cyber risk, there's regular and structured reporting, and evidence that decisions are being taken deliberately and not by default. Next, take a fresh look at your supplier contracts. So many organizations still rely on outdated or inconsistent clauses that simply don't reflect modern cyber risk. Introducing consistent risk-aligned clauses covering things like incident notification, audit rights, and subcontractor controls, that can make a significant difference if something were to go wrong. It's also important to refresh or create your incident response plan, and critically, to ensure that legal involvement is embedded from the outset. And then alongside that, I would strongly recommend building an internal breach notification playbook. So that clearly set out your escalation path, your decision-making criteria, and your communication steps. Because when time pressures are high and information is limited, having this mapped out in advance is invaluable. Another key step is to prioritize documentation. So every decision, every assessment, every mitigation step that you take should be logged. Because if you ever face regulatory scrutiny, being able to show clear, defensible decision-making makes an enormous difference. Regulators want to see evidence that decisions were considered and that they were proportionate and that they were documented at all times. I'd also encourage you to review your insurance position, not just in isolation, but in the context of your suppliers and your contractual agreements. Misalignment is one of the most common weaknesses we still see in real incidents, and it can significantly complicate your recovery. The reality today is that organizations must go beyond basic compliance. The standard regulators expect is a legally defensible cyber strategy, one that you can evidence, justify, and stand over when challenged. Ultimately, the message is very clear. You need to have the right controls, the right governance, the right documentation, and also the right culture to manage cyber risk in a defensible and structured way. Technical measures alone will not satisfy regulators. They'll want to see the full ecosystems of control working together. So that is all from me today. I believe the slides will be circulated after this. If you have any questions at all, please do not hesitate to get in touch. But for now, I'll hand back to Stephen for any questions.
Aisling, thanks very much for that. I always love a presentation, particularly from lawyers, that not only gives you kind of clarity on the legal position, but actually offers real practical steps that people can take now. And you very much hit the brief there, which is why we partner so regularly with Mills Selig on these things. People, particularly in manufacturing, like practical things they can do, things they can take away and get cracking on today. And your presentation was rich with that content. So I'll maybe kind of pick up on a couple of those pieces if you're okay. And then if others have questions, then feel free to add them into the chat. I think the kind of first thing for me is that the damage here can be really severe. I think when most people think about cyber, they think about somebody getting into the systems and altering the bank positions of customers or suppliers and diverting money elsewhere to a source that it shouldn't, or to a location that it shouldn't be sent to. So that this is more than just stealing money. This is about actually potentially taking control of factory systems, of supply chains, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that kind of severity of the damage is much, much wider than I think most people understand it to be. And when you're speaking with your clients, do they recognize that? Do they understand just the severity of what potentially can happen here, both from a business as usual and operational point of view, but also a regulatory and a financial position?
I think it's very easy to not think of the risks. I think it's when you see cases, in particular that Toyota case, that really hammers it home that this can have really significant consequences. It isn't just about missed payments. Like your entire production can completely grind to a halt, and if you're not producing anything, then you can't sell anything. So that can really impact your business. So it isn't really important to stay alive to these issues and be prepared and to take steps to try to avoid them where you can.
And what you made clear was, I suppose it shouldn't have been news to me, but it certainly felt like it was news to me, that this area isn't just about being exposed individually as a business to attacks, but actually there's a requirement here, contractual requirement here, on you as a business, potentially from your customer. And equally, there's a requirement here for you as a business to make sure that you're protected in terms of the contracts that you would have with your supply chain. So the exposure here is to customers, it's to your supply chain. It's also regulatory exposure in terms of markets that you may be supplying into. You talked about some stuff that's coming through from the EU, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think the kind of really practical piece of advice there, and the starting point that you suggested there, was to do that gap analysis, to do the legal and technical gap analysis. And is this something that you and colleagues in Mills Selig support businesses with, or is it something that should really be done internally to begin with?
No, we can certainly help with that. When you are doing a gap analysis, I mean, it's a legal and technical gap analysis. So firstly, you'll need to understand what regulations actually apply to me, and that's where we can help. It's also important to get, your cybersecurity experts on board as well, because they will be able to advise on the actual controls that you have in place and what would be most appropriate for your business in light of the data that you hold. So it's getting everyone in a room. So it's not just lawyers, it's also technical experts. It also is operational individuals within the organizations. It could be finance directors. So what you want to do is try to get as many people in the room as possible. And yeah, that's certainly something we can help with from the legal side.
And I think that that's a really important message here is that this is such an existential risk that actually multiple people within an organization need to be involved in the contractual
Mhm,
side as well
mhm.
as anything else. I mean, I think most manufacturing, most businesses would perhaps leave the contractual side to their finance director or someone like that to talk to the likes of yourselves or let's face it, the cut and paste previous contracts that they may have had, but
Yeah.
that comes with very significant risks now. I think is the message. Is that correct?
Yeah, it does. You need to make sure that the risk you're signing up to in your contracts or that you're asking your suppliers to sign up to is proportionate and that it does protect you in the event that something does go wrong. I mean, most of the time you hope that when you sign a contract, you put it in a drawer, never to be seen again. But more often than not, that's not the reality. You need to make sure that you have a contract in place that is robust and that it does protect you and that it does speak to the services that you're either providing or that you're obtaining from another provider.
And you said it in your commentary, but it wasn't listed in terms of words on a slide. But my ears certainly pricked up when you said that this has significant impacts on the rights and freedoms of individuals.
Hmm.
Uh, can you give us a kind of worst case scenario there that or an example where the rights and freedoms of individuals within a business may be in jeopardy?
Yeah, I mean, um, most businesses will process personal data to some degree. If you have employees, you're collecting their personal data, so you're going to be caught by GDPR. And if you lose that data, or if somebody has unauthorized access to that information, or they publish it, including things like their bank account details, so you'll be paying your staff. So if their bank account details are um, subject to a cyber incident, then that's going to have very real impacts for individuals. Um, in that case, you will probably need to notify the ICO that you've suffered a data breach. You'll also need to notify those individuals affected so that they can take steps to protect themselves and watch out for any sort of unauthorized activity on their account. Um, in terms of fines, from the ICO, I mean, worst case scenario, they can fine up to 17.5 million or 4% of your global turnover. So really, really significant fines. And what we're seeing is that, the ICO is not afraid to issue fines, and neither are other regulators across the EU. I mean, GDPR has been in force for almost 10 years. So there is expectations that organizations have measures in place to protect that data. So the grace period, I suppose, is kind of running out and we're starting to see more and more fines starting to follow through.
And in the past, certainly when I was growing up, I used to worry about shady characters and people in shadowy laneways as being a potential threat towards you. But obviously we live in a world now where AI,
Mm,
so it's not even an individual, but AI can
no.
actually be the threat. I
Hmm.
mean, what are the kind of practical steps now that organizations can take to protect themselves against those kind of AI enabled attacks?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, AI is now being used to generate really highly realistic phishing emails that can impersonate suppliers. There's the deep fakes, and that means that attacks are more targeted and harder to spot, but they are still relying on very familiar weaknesses. So on that basis, AI doesn't really change anything, but it does raise the bar on basics. So in terms of practical steps, you need to make sure that you have really strong security measures in place. Also introducing simple identity verification steps. So particularly if you're dealing with payments, make sure that you're not dealing with an AI clone. Make sure that you're, speaking to a real person. Education here is a massive thing. So staff need to understand that emails, invoices, and even phone calls can be convincingly faked, and that slowing down and checking, that's not a failure. That is a really excellent control to have. So generally, if you're able to spot any unusual activity or any abnormal behavior early on, that can prevent a small incident from becoming something more major.
And obviously, like we really enjoy working alongside Mills Selig, kind of locally owned uh, firm. Deal with directors and deal with colleagues right through the business as well. And I know that you work with some of Northern Ireland's largest businesses, but the vast majority of the client base that you will have, as most people in most professional services in Northern Ireland will have, our SME community. They make up the
Hmm.
bulk of manufacturers. They make up the bulk of our
Hmm.
business community. So those larger organizations quite often will have uh, layers of teams of people locally or globally that kind of deal with this stuff. But because we're a small SME based economy, and what are the kind of realistic things that people can do at that scale
Hmm.
that offers them some sort of protection here?
Yeah, so it's a very common concern, particularly for smaller manufacturing organizations. It is one that regulators do understand. They're not expecting SMEs to look like large organizations with, big legal or compliance teams. But what they are looking for is reasonable effort and defensible decision making. So first thing that I would recommend you do is prioritize. So you don't need to tackle everything at once. Focus on the areas that matter most to your business. So where does your personal data sit? Which systems support production and which suppliers have the greatest access to your systems? Also, keep your governance simple, a clear escalation path or a short incident response plan, and the right people involved, that can go a long way. And also, if you don't have in-house experience, it's entirely reasonable to use external support. So for, a gap analysis or for your contract reviews or your incident responses. So what I would recommend is to show that you have thought about the risks and you have taken proportionate steps to take them. And that's really what regulators would expect of SMEs.
And obviously, I mean, 9 out of 10 manufacturers sell externally to Northern Ireland. We have some very important straight to consumer brands, but most of our manufacturers work with larger manufacturing businesses globally as part of their supply chain.
Mhm.
Uh, so if a small manufacturing business works with one of those much larger, more sophisticated customers or suppliers for that matter,
Mhm.
and it really doesn't have that kind of negotiating leverage, what are the kind of reasonable steps that they can take to manage that supply chain risk for them?
Yeah, again, it's an issue that regulators will understand. For many of those global or enterprise level organizations, their terms are effectively a take it or leave it. And in practice, it's all but impossible to negotiate changes to those terms. Um, Regulators, they're not expecting small organizations to rewrite the contracts of technology giants. But what they're looking for, again, it's those reasonable, proportionate steps. Again, prioritize, focus on suppliers that matter. If you're working with any of those large global organizations, they'll usually have their security controls well documented. So they'll often publish their certifications, they might publish their audit reports, or they'll usually have the technical security measures that they have in place. They'll usually have those published online as well. So even though you can't change the contract, most likely, what you can do is review the information that they've got online, like those technical security measures. That provides meaningful comfort. And also by looking at that and basing your decision on proceeding with that provider, that evidences that you've done your due diligence and you've thought about the risk and you've made a conscious decision.
And you talked there about evidence, and there's a question in the chat from Craig about how should a chain of custody for assets be evidenced to avoid tampering and maintain evidence integrity. I mean, right throughout this presentation, you talked about putting in place systems, starting with reporting at a board level, cyber security risk, ensuring that there's evidence for regulators or others that you're taking all of those precautionary steps as best as possible, given the scale of the challenge. But how should that chain of custody of those assets actually be evidenced to maintain that evidence integrity?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, your governance processes are really key. You need to make sure everything is really well documented. Again, you need to look at your contracts, what your contracts say, and make sure that it's clear from there. In the absence of having any documents or contracts, that's going to be very difficult to process. So putting together a process in place now to make sure that you're able to track that will leave it a lot more straightforward.
And a final one for me, and hopefully nobody on this call or people that are watching later have to endure this, but if people do suspect that they have been subject to a data breach, but then they later find out that they haven't been, is there a way of reversing out of this? Is there a way of kind of unnotifying the ICO or others?
Yeah, I mean, what I would say is notifying too early. That's usually safer than not notifying at all. Regulators know that the early stages of an incident are really messy and you won't have certainty on day one. And what they are comfortable with is the staged notifications. So that means you make the notification based on your awareness and what you think you know, and then updating as the investigation progresses. So if it transpires then that you haven't suffered a data breach or there's no personal data affected, there's no issue in then notifying the ICO to say, actually, there has been no data compromised. So usually the ICO is rarely likely to criticize you in that scenario. What regulators will react badly to is silence or delay or waiting for the sort of perfect information that never quite arrives. So yeah, recommendation is to notify early because it's always easier to then, I suppose, update the ICO with updated information that actually it's not as big a deal as we originally thought. That's better than notifying too late.
And I think anybody on this call who is a director will have got notification from Companies House recently that they suspected that there may have been some sort of breach in their systems. They were alerting us as customers of Companies House in advance and saying that they will be speaking with the ICO, but it appears that it is not a data breach, so to speak. I just think that was a very interesting example very recently for people where better to be cautious than to be proven wrong later.
Definitely.
Better to get out ahead and alert people like myself and others who may have data stored by Companies House to take whatever appropriate actions that we needed to take as individuals. So I think that's probably a good case in point to kind of describe what's happened there. Aisling, we're going to finish there if that's okay.
Yep.
As I said at the beginning, if people have very specific inquiries, then they should really reach out to you, and your details are on the screen there, or even contact us directly and we can put people in contact. But law is a very interesting area. Most people, particularly when it comes to this type of subject matter, find it incredibly tricky and difficult. So to actually leave people with very good practical advice is incredibly valuable, and I thank you for that. From my perspective, I mean, I certainly learned a lot just about what that kind of cyber resilience piece is more than just being worried that someone might steal your money. This is an existential issue that people can take control of systems. People on your supply chain, but also your customer base and in markets will be demanding that you demonstrate some sort of resilience in this area. And that begins and ends with the contracts that you secure with customers. So taking on board the practical advice that you've offered, but also reaching out and ensuring that your contracts are up to date, I think is really critically important. If people do have a place to start, it seems to be to start with that gap analysis. And that will identify where the risks are for them from a compliance, a regulatory, but also a contractual point of view. So do take that first step today. I just want to finish by saying thanks to you and to colleagues in Mills Selig for your support for Manufacturing NI and your continued willingness to share your wisdom with us and with our audience. This is part of a series of webinars that we do with Mills Selig in law areas that are interesting to our manufacturing community, and today's just another really great example of that. And just finally, just by finishing off to say that Mills Selig will be continuing to support Manufacturing NI through our Manufacturing Month, which takes place in May each year, and that's about and the recognition from your own firm about the importance of our sector and celebrating and supporting the sector for the benefit of the Northern Ireland economy. Do reach out if people have any particular legal areas that they'd like to explore. Do reach out if you want to be put in connection with Ashley and our colleagues at various parts of the business. And we'll see you all again at our next session. Thanks very much.
Thank you.